Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Welcome to this episode of the Means of Grace podcast. My name is Kim Ingram, and I am the Director of Ministerial Services for the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church, and I will be the host today. I'm excited about this conversation with the leaders of the Uwharrie District as they share with us some of the approach they've had toward vitality markers and offer questions that a church or a leader can consider to determine vitality regardless of their size or context. We also hear some new approaches to statistical reporting that might actually get a leader excited about doing their statistical reporting each year. And we hear examples of how churches in this district have been engaging their community, and we learn through that some of the unique characteristics of this region of North Carolina. We are excited to have our guest with us today, and we are grateful you are here today to listen and to learn and to discover ways that you can grow and serve in ministry as you hear these stories of how others have been doing so. So today on the Means of Grace podcast, we have with us Laura Auten, who is the District Superintendent and Missional Strategist for the Uwharrie District, Katie Lineberger, who is the District Vitality Associate, and Kris Mares, who is the Missional Engagement Associate. I really look forward to talking with you all today. I think the Uwharrie District is doing a lot of really interesting things in ministry, so I look forward to hearing more about how you all work together and how you all do ministry in the Uwharrie District of the Western North Carolina Conference. Laura, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about the district so that our listeners who maybe don't live in the Uwharrie District or not familiar with it get a sense of what area we're talking about?
The Uwharrie District is east of Charlotte and south of Winston-Salem and Greensboro. We have 143 churches in the Uwharrie District. We're a district of mostly small rural churches, but also churches in towns. We include Monroe, Salisbury, Albemarle, Wadesboro, Asheboro, Denton, Lexington are the cities and towns in our district. We have all of Anson County, the eastern half of Union County, almost all of Stanley County, almost all of Rowan County, a lot of Davidson County, and almost all of Randolph County, plus one church in Cabarrus County and two churches in Montgomery County. So we touch on a lot of different places in the conference, it seems. We are also home to the North Carolina Zoo, Seagrove Pottery, Lake Tillery, Baden Lake, High Rock Lake, the birthplace of cheer wine, and Lexington Barbecue. And I'm sure I'm sure I've missed a lot of things there.
Well, that's great. That would make lots of people want to go into the Uwharrie District for a variety of reasons. There's a lot going on in the Uwharrie District.
National Forest, the Uwharrie National Forest.
I was going to ask you about the name for people who aren't familiar with that. So it's named after the National Forest that's in your district.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
I want to talk a little bit about the district. I know an emphasis for you all in Uwharrie has been developing partnerships, especially helping churches to partner with one another and also with organizations in their communities. I think I saw on your district webpage that you have a theme of "We're Better Together," and I completely believe that in kind of all circumstances, we're better together. Laura, you are the vision caster for the district as the superintendent and the missional strategist. Why has this been an important approach for you?
Well, it's an important approach because it's biblical. We, as the body of Christ, and bringing our different gifts and ministries, connecting with one another so that the mission can be stronger. It's a part of our Wesleyan heritage to be connectional and connected. I also think that the smaller churches, smaller congregations in our district really lend itself to to a model of better together, we're able to impact our communities when we can join our resources and our efforts. There's just innumerable examples of churches doing that. We have a hygiene pantry in a local school in the Davidson County area where churches have worked together, a Habitat House in Rowan County, a mobile food pantry in Anson County. All of those are examples of churches working together, whereas one church could not do that on their own. And so it's important because of the context of our district, but it's also important because that is it's a biblical model. It's a part of our Wesleyan heritage.
Well, and a while back, all of our districts were asked to create missional networks where churches work connected to one another for missional reasons in their communities. And Kris, I think maybe that comes under your portfolio of work, is to work with a missional network. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, for people who aren't familiar with them, kind of what they are, but especially how they operate in the Uwharrie District, and maybe an example of a missional network that has partnered in a particular way in their community.
Well, missional networks are smaller clusters of churches that it may be a county or a part of a county, but a geographical area that makes sense that they would work together and partner for mission in their community and within their context. And so we have 11 missional networks, and they're all doing something different. That's the beauty of the missional networks. They are able to function in a way that works best for them and their context and their community. Some are clergy working together and providing, especially during the pandemic, peer support for one another, and that's a beautiful thing. Many are working together on projects in serving their community. I mentioned a few just a moment ago. One of the projects that has been interesting lately is in the South Davidson Missional Network. The churches there have been able to work together. They've been working together for a food and hygiene pantry at a middle school, but now they've moved to working in a local elementary school and getting that food pantry stocked for a new year, and warm coats and hats and things for students in the winter months. And so that's exciting to see a cluster of small churches have such a big impact in their local school system. But they all function in just a little bit different ways based on what works for that group of churches in that community.
So is there a way, if laity want to be involved in that way in their community through their missional network, that they can plug in if they're not familiar with it?
Yeah, several of the missional networks have laity that are a part of the missional network and have leadership roles in the work that they're doing together. Of course, with every missional network being different, the best way, I think, for a lay person to find out about what their missional network is doing is simply just to talk to their pastor. Every pastor and church is a part of a missional network, and so they just need to talk to their pastor and see how they can get plugged into those meetings or into those projects.
And I guess that would probably be true across the annual conference then, is the best way for people to plug into their missional network is through their pastor, if they're not familiar with it already.
Absolutely. And some missional networks may have a Facebook page or a Facebook group that they use to help communicate. So church folks can look for that information in their area as well.
Oh, that'd be great.
Another way that we have tried to live into a culture of being better together is how we've structured our district organization. Instead of having a separate group to work on missional engagement and another group to work on church vitality, we've combined that into one district ministry council that includes both laity and clergy. It includes leaders from other committees, all of us together discerning and working and thinking together about different areas of missional engagement and church vitality, so that we can see where those areas dovetail, and so that we can focus our energy and our resources more in a more targeted way. We have small working groups such as Fresh Expressions, a community meal network. We have a recovery ministry task force, and that has seemed to be a more efficient and effective way for us to do some significant work together. Especially in the Uwharrie District, the ministry of churches can be categorized as missional engagement, but really is about church vitality, where church vitality becomes a form of missional engagement. And so we found it helpful to really combine those together.
Well, in that church vitality, you can't have a vital church unless that's not missionally engaged and that doesn't have the involvement of the laity. So does it make sense to have three separate committees, but for all of us to be able to come together, recognizing that all of these things make up a vital church. And so let's do this work together.
I think for local churches too, I don't want to say it's a model because we use that word a lot, but it shows that a simplified structure of leadership is possible at all levels of the local church. Mm-hmm. And so as some of our smaller churches have been moving to a simple leadership structure, our district is able to say, look, we can change too. We all can change. And I think that's a great example and encouragement for our local churches too.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about vitality as well, because throughout the conference, we focused for many years on helping churches become more vital. We have lots of vital churches, but we can always grow and kind of become more vital. Laura, I wonder if you could talk with us about what vital means or what a vital church looks like.
One of the things that we talk about in the Uwharrie District is that a church can be vital regardless of the size or location. And we've worked really hard to identify what that looks like and to provide some resources around that. I think the core piece of a vital congregation, regardless of size or location, is that there's a core of spiritual leaders. There's a core of people who are growing spiritually, who are spiritually mature, who are consistently encountering and engaging with Scripture, who are wanting to develop that vital relationship with Jesus Christ, where they're leading and acting out of a spiritual center, where they're not just Christian in name only, where they are able to understand themselves as a disciple of Christ and not a member of a church. Someone who can put their faith into action, someone who can then lead others to helping the congregation live out what they are believing. I think that if that is in place with that core spiritual leadership, then all of the other things all of the other ways that we would describe a vital congregation, that's going to flow from that. I think vital congregations are actively sharing their faith with others. They're actively witnessing to the gospel. They're inviting other people to know Christ. They are seeking to make a difference in the world around them. They are seeking to engage with the least, the last, and the lost. I think that there's a sense of the congregation growing in generosity, practicing the biblical command of tithing. I think there's a sense in that congregation, in a vital congregation, that there's an alignment between the life of the congregation and the mission of Jesus, that everything that happens in the congregation is to accomplish Jesus' mission for the church. There's the better together attitude or culture in a congregation where they're partnering with others in their community, other churches, other agencies, in order to have maximum impact on their community for Christ. That's a description that is hard to capture sometimes, and we're always on the journey towards vitality. But those are some of the key things that I see important in a vital congregation.
So Katie, as the District Vitality Associate, I'm guessing that a big part of your ministry is to support churches in becoming more vital. So I wondered if you have some particular resources or tools that you've been able to share with churches to help them think about what maybe their particular call or giftedness is within their specific community or context.
Yeah. So right before I began this appointment around this time last year, Laura had been working with the vitality markers, which is a numerical tool that we often use with our church legacy initiative churches. But she took those markers and kind of created this document that explains what the numbers teach us. Because we often, numbers don't tell the whole story. But they do tell us something. And Laura actually said this just the other day, that a number represents a person, right? And so she took each of there's 5 vitality markers in the originally, and she took them and described kind of what they reveal. And I think she'll talk about those more later. I've kind of bought into this idea that the vitality markers are a tool not just for church legacy churches, but all of our churches can use as sort of as a self-assessment, self-evaluation, if you will. And so as the year kind of went on, I developed a worksheet, if you will, that used year-end statistical numbers that pastors input, which they're doing right now for 2020 numbers. And I used those and created a worksheet that kind of shows how a church is doing percentage-wise with the vitality markers using their numbers. And then Laura met with, she was doing consultations throughout the end of this year, showed them this, this worksheet so they could see kind of how their church is doing in relation to these vitality markers. I created a worksheet for, I think, every church in the district. And I found some interesting trends as I was looking through this. And one of them was that there were many, many churches that have huge percentage of people participating in small group studies, like 98%, 110%, right? If you have vacation Bible schools and things like that, all those fall into that. And so those numbers are going to be big. But then it was interesting to note the number of churches that had those high numbers in small group studies also had a disproportionately low participation in missional outreach. Now, I'm not drawing any conclusions, but it was curious to me, right? What does that mean? What does that tell us? It made me wonder about this, about what is our discipleship that we're doing in small group studies, is that translating into real life, like hands-on service and discipleship formation? And so through that, Laura and I continued to work with the vitality markers. I then created a discussion guide in hopes that a church leadership team might be able to see that their numbers, while they don't tell the whole story, they can be a beginning point. And so the discussion guide has, questions like what significant life events in the church have taken place that might contribute to why the numbers that you see are what they are, right? Or if your numbers reflect a robust participation in hands-on missional outreach, what stories can you tell as evidence of a real relationship building with those that you serve? Or if they show robust participation in small group studies, what stories can you tell as evidence that those studies are contributing to the transformation and growth of people's discipleship? So that we're not just looking at the numbers, but what we hope for them, what these things to produce. Yeah, and I can also share the template for the worksheet so the church could using their year-end statistical numbers, just kind of plug in and be able to see percentage-wise kind of how they're doing, and really just for some honest reflection to be able to see this is where we are. Do these numbers reflect our preferred reality? And if not, what steps can we take to get there?
Maybe that's fantastic because, as you said, we're in the year-end reporting time of the year, and it is not a favorite task of so many of our leaders. And so maybe this would be a motivating factor to get those done, so that churches and leaders in the churches can look at the data and then see what does it really mean for them and what difference can it make. So I'm excited about this, and I hope that you'll be able to tell us some stories about what you've discovered after it's been utilized for a while and what you're learning from that. One of the things Laura mentioned was kind of some of the outdoor stuff that you all have within your district. You have lakes and rivers and the Uwharrie National Forest. And I think you've had, especially in COVID, some leaders try some creative things outdoors that I wonder if they'll want to continue even when we get back to being able to do more things indoors together. Would you tell us a little bit about what those ministries have looked like?
Yeah, so we, as Laura had said when she was describing the district, we're the district of lakes, and having the National Forest and Morrow Mountain, and that's just a natural place for people to gather and to really experience God and discipleship even. And so we have some, one church that has a ministry, and a lot of these are seasonal, right? Because our lake areas have the population increases heavily in the summertime, and so a lot of them are seasonal. But there's one church that does biscuits for boaters during the summertime. They make biscuits, and I guess they go down to the dock where in the morning before they all get out on their boat, and they provide these biscuits. And kind of create community that way. We have another church that through some deep discernment, their church is just off of a lake. And through some deep discernment, they realized their community are the people of the lake, but they weren't doing enough to really build relationships with the residents there. And so they happened to get access to some lakefront property to just use. They now worship during the summer outside on the lake. And, all people in the community, some will be driving up in their golf carts, people will be out in their boats, maybe listening on the lake shore. And so that's been really exciting to hear about. And we've just formed a district fresh expressions team. And there is much enthusiasm within that group to explore the development of some fresh expressions around things like paddleboarding or hiking or kayaking, just really wanting to utilize these outdoor resources that we have and the hobbies that people take in to begin to reach out and build relationships with people who may be hiking on Sunday morning or out on their boat on Sunday morning, but still long for that kind of community connection and that something, that faith connection. And so we're beginning some planning now towards the summer to see what that might look like, to explore the possibility of some of those different types of outdoors fresh expressions, because that's where the people are, especially during the summer. And so how can we go to where they are
instead of trying to get them to come indoors to you, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, I want to be outside on Sundays too.
That's what I thought. So for the church members or the clergy who like to do those things, paddleboard and boat, and what a great way to combine ministry and kind of your personal passions into one thing. That would be fun and exciting.
A long-standing ministry in our conference has been the High Rock Lake Ministry, which is a outdoor summer worship service. And so a lot of folks probably have heard of that. It's been around for a long time, and they have continued to be very vital and are connected with the churches in that area as well, and kind of the Southmont, Lexington area, and the Macedonia Church there in particular. We also have within the bounds of the district, Mount Shepherd Retreat Center. And that is a really great resource in our district, and is conducive to all kinds of outdoor opportunities for ministry. To me, an interesting thing in the pandemic has been that many people, and I'm sure this is across the conference, were able to have parking lot services and outdoor worship services, and it's been interesting to hear about the varieties. A lot of folks have invested in FM transmitters for those parking lot services, and some churches are utilizing their picnic shelters and other facilities just in some creative ways. And so I hope that some of that will continue even when we are able to gather safely indoors, because I think that speaks to the need that many have to be in the midst of God's nature, or to be more in tune and in touch with the outdoors.
There's another in down in Anson County. I've been having conversation with some pastors down there, and they're trying to think about how to capitalize on the hunting population. That there's hunting clubs and huge groups of people coming to hunt in their area, and where might there be space for developing Christian community within that kind of outdoor experience. And so I'm really excited about that aspect of our district, and just the possibilities for creating new expressions of Christian community and discipleship formation. It's really exciting, and there's people passionate about it too.
And that's the great thing is that there are people who want to go do it, figure it out, and make it happen. So that's really cool. Laura, we were talking a minute ago about the statistical reports, and another piece of data that comes in our statistical reports are worship attendance, professions of faith, and baptisms. And it seems like in our annual conference, and I think maybe in the United Methodist Church, for a long time, it feels like these are particularly important markers for a growing church. I wonder if that's still true. And if so, what do these markers indicate, and why are they important?
I think the importance of remembering that every number is a person is key, as Katie had mentioned earlier. And I think the first person I heard use that phrase was Mark Key. And this was been years ago, I think probably when he was serving as on the conference staff and congregational development. And I heard him say that, and that has stuck with me because we know that there's the numbers, there's always more to the story, but we have to remember that each number is a person and that counts. And so for so long, worship attendance has been the way to gauge a sense of activity and a sense of vitality for a congregation. I think way back, it used to be church membership. And that's how we would measure and compare congregations, is how many folks that you have on the roll. Well, we came to realize that really didn't tell us a whole lot, because there were so many people on church rolls that were not active or engaged. And so worship attendance has become the place to measure that. But I really think we're in a time where that's changing, and that's no longer accurate, and even more so during a pandemic, when we're also trying to figure out how to faithfully count and measure online participation and online viewing. I think looking ahead, we are going to need to emphasize and figure out how to measure engagement and relationships. How do we determine disciples who are engaged out of their faith journey? How are they engaged in ministry? How is community being built in small groups and in a congregation? How are relationships being built between members of the church and people who do not know Jesus, who do not know of the church? How do we measure that? I really feel that that's where we're headed, and we're going to need to spend some time figuring all of that out.
Well, and some of it then goes back to what Katie was talking about, I think, related to telling stories. And some of it's numbers, and some of it will be about narrative. And how do you tell some of the stories to really paint a picture of where a church is and how a church is operating in their community or in their context. I do think sometimes it's discouraging to church folk, though, that the numbers that at least historically have seemed the most important sometimes don't change much. And I just wonder if you have any words of kind of encouragement for people that might be in that category.
And sometimes there are certain communities, certain areas, certain regions where you're not going to see the change in those numbers. Many of the areas in the Uwharrie District, there's not the population growth that you might see in a suburban area or a metropolitan area. It doesn't mean that there's not people there that, do not need to hear the gospel, but it's just a different environment. And so you wouldn't see the changes in worship attendance, for example. And so my encouragement would be for those churches to, as they complete their statistical reports and reflect on that, to and look at their history, of the history of their statistical report, that they focus on three questions in the midst of all that, to really focus on their identity, who are we, and to focus on their purpose. Secondly, their purpose. What does God want us to be about? What is God calling us to do? And then their context. Thirdly, who is our neighbor? If churches can really wrestle with those questions, and I think that can go a long way to promoting and cultivating vitality. Who are we? Who are we? Who are we in Christ? Who are we as God's people? What does God want us to be about here in this place? And who is our neighbor? How can we show love to our neighbor? So whether you have a congregation of 15 people or a congregation of 50 people, a congregation of 200 people, those questions, I believe, will cultivate a sense of vitality.
And the last of those things you talked about is kind of context, community, and your neighborhood or your neighbors. And Kris, I wondered if you could talk to us just a little bit about the ways that the churches in your district are being neighbors, the ways they're meeting the needs of the community in some intentional ways.
Sure. I think many churches in the Uwharrie District, like across our conference, across the nation, across the world, a primary concern and a primary way of serving their community has been feeding people right now, finding creative ways to continue to physically feed hungry people. They've been doing that with takeout meals, or when the weather was nice, eating outdoors. Some churches have moved to building like a blessing box or a good neighbor pantry that stays on the property of the church, that they continue to fill, and people take what they need and give what they can. Or they've been working with local school districts to identify hungry families that are connected to the schools, and doing not just the weekend backpack kinds of things of food that we've been doing, but larger boxes of meals, considering students are home all day now, and people are home that working at home or what have you. So they've been finding creative ways to continue to feed people, which I think is beautiful. Across the last few years in the Uwharrie District, we've had an emphasis on some racial equity work. And so there's been some really neat partnerships, cross-racial partnerships of churches working for small group studies and their own personal spiritual growth, but also to collaborate together for community vacation Bible school with churches of different denominations. White churches partnering with primarily Hispanic churches or African-American churches. So those have been some really neat partnerships that have been happening as well. And then there's been some building work that's being done. Habitat for Humanity, one of our missional networks, has continued to build houses together. But there's also been some partnerships that have been about home repair and working primarily with senior citizens who are not able to do their home repair work. So that's been some interesting partnerships that have been happening as well.
So there's no lack of need, is there? If we'll just kind of open our eyes and go look for it, there's a need that can be met in a way that we as the church can meet that need. So as we conclude our conversation together, I want to ask you a question that I'd love for each of you to answer. And that is, what is one simple thing that you would put on a New Year's resolution list for a leader to do that engages their church or community so that the kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven? Katie, would you want to kick us off with that question?
All right. So I'm not really one that likes New Year's resolutions, but if I had to pick one, I think for a church, and given the year that we've had, I think a good resolution for our leaders as individuals, and maybe even as a church community, is to make a friend with someone who doesn't look like you. Find someone in your community, build relationships with someone that doesn't look like you. It could be, a church, but to spend some time listening and learning, to build bridges with someone which the world might see there's nothing that you have in common, right, on the outside, but how can we be, again, that's part of the healing, so contributing to the healing in our nation. So that's what I would say to kind of resolve to do, is to begin to build relationships with people that don't look like you. But I'm much more, I lean much more towards like intentions. I like those better. And so the intention I might encourage our churches and leaders and communities to think about is to think about your why, to be intentional, and the things that we do, to ask yourself, why are we doing this? And as the vaccine rolls out and we start to go back to more in-person gatherings, and we think about going back to doing the things, that we used to do, that we were able to do before the pandemic, is to slow down and ask yourself why first. Why are we doing this? Is it because we've always done it, we miss doing it? Or is there a deeper kingdom building purpose to this? And the hope is that there is. So that's what I would say. The intention is to be intentional and to ask yourself why.
That's great. Thank you, Katie. How about you, Kris?
Well, like Katie, my sort of New Year's resolution or piece of advice would be about reflection and personal reflection. I think this pandemic has given all of us a unique opportunity to slow down and quiet down and really reflect on our own personal spiritual growth. Right now, and within my work as Missional Engagement Associate, I think particularly in the areas of racial equity or racial justice and poverty. What do we really believe about that? What does the Bible really say in those areas? And how am I living into the kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven? And the other piece with that is Sabbath keeping, particularly for my clergy colleagues or other ministry leaders. I think this is a time when we can be really intentional and need to be really intentional and radical in our Sabbath keeping. So those would be my two things.
Yeah, and I think that those are really helpful things. Thank you for that. And Laura, how would you answer that question, or any other question you want to answer, or how would you wrap us up?
I think in light of our experience in the pandemic, my intention, resolution, advice would be, may God give us eyes to see what is possible. And may God give us a heart of courage so that we're not afraid to take a step into something that is different or unknown, that we not be afraid of change.
great conversation that we just had with the leaders in the Uwharrie District. I really am taking away that when ministry may feel overwhelming, or the needs in our community or the opportunities in this day and time to be in ministry are just expansive, that they have offered us some questions that we can ask, some ways that we can focus in our community, in our context, and among our church leaders. What is important and what are the next steps, the next faithful steps for ministry in our context, whatever it is. And so I'm grateful for the ways that they have shared with us some of the things that they are doing in the Uwharrie District, but also for how applicable it is to any leader in the church and ways that it can be used for ministry for anyone that is serving in this way.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.